Hello and welcome. This is the third installment of the Philosophy in the News series, and the purpose of this series is to give commentary on current issues in the world of philosophy, or in some cases, to comment on issues outside of philosophy through a philosophical lens. One current issue that is somewhat controversial is this recent decision of YouTube to remove public dislike numbers from videos. And I thought it would be interesting to take a look at this from a philosophical point of view. This week, YouTube announced it will be gradually changing the way users can rate videos on the website. Over an unspecified length of time, the company will phase out the dislike counter on videos, so that only the number of likes a video receives will be visible to the public. Viewers will still be able to give videos they like a thumbs up and videos they dislike a thumbs down, and creators can still see both of these numbers on their own videos. However, only the number of likes will be visible to everyone in the public. In an announcement released on the YouTube creators channel, the company claims this decision to hide the dislike counter comes from a concern over the potential for harassment. YouTube claims that smaller channels are particularly vulnerable to something they call dislike attacks, which are apparently coordinated group efforts to downvote a channel's videos. Thus, the aim of removing the number of dislikes from public view seems to center around preventing harm, especially to more vulnerable smaller channels, and fostering a safer and more friendly community overall. Furthermore, YouTube apparently feels that applying this policy site-wide is the only effective means of curtailing this kind of harassment. An opt-in, opt-out system whereby creators could disable the dislike counter on their own videos if they chose to do so was, according to YouTube, not effective at preventing harassment. Instead, at least this is what YouTube is saying, creators who opted to disable the dislike on their own videos were frequently harassed for doing precisely that. How extensive this kind of harassment was, I'm not sure. But in any case, YouTube seems to think that a site-wide removal of the dislike counter is the most effective way to curtail certain forms of harassment. This decision appears to have been met with overwhelmingly negative responses from creators and viewers alike. One of the major lines of criticism that I've seen is that people are very worried that removing a public dislike number from videos could potentially lead to an increase in people following bad information. I think that's a legitimate concern. I think most people would also say that wanting to prevent harassment is also a legitimate concern. But whose concern is more important? That's where the harm principle comes in. The harm principle is a fairly simple idea. It begins with the assumption that sometimes some people's behavior can cause harm to others. But presumably, we don't want to unnecessarily restrict someone's ability to do things that they enjoy, because a lot of times the behaviors that can cause harm to some people are precisely those that give pleasure to someone else. And they don't necessarily have to be intentionally causing harm. Therefore, we want to develop some kind of principle against which we can measure whether or not we are overstepping our boundaries if we should want to restrict or possibly prevent someone from engaging from one behavior or another. And Mill's harm principle holds that the only time it's morally permissible to restrict or prevent someone else's behavior is if that behavior causes harm. Preventing harm to others is the only moral reason, Mill argues, for restricting or preventing someone's ability to possibly enjoy something. For example, suppose we have someone named Tom who works in an office, and Tom is a smoker. Tom has to walk 3 flights of stairs from his office to go outside and have a cigarette break. He would much rather just smoke at his desk. Now, suppose Tom is the only smoker in the office. Everyone else he works with does not smoke and would really rather that he did not do this. Whose pleasure should be considered more important? Tom's pleasure that he would derive from smoking inside, or the pleasure that people would derive from not having to put up with his smoke? This is a case where the harm principle could be put into effect. Forcing Tom to have to step outside for his smoke break is obviously something that would be against his will. It would be something that he would prefer not to have to do. On the other hand, allowing him to smoke inside would almost certainly cause harm to his coworkers. Additionally, we might want to note that the harm caused by Tom's smoke to his coworkers is almost certainly going to be much greater than the harm that Tom might incur from having to be inconvenienced by having to walk down the flights of stairs to go outside. The harm that he would incur from this would be pretty minimal compared to the harm that all of his other coworkers would have to put up with. Thus, based on the harm principle, it seems morally permissible to, in this case, prevent Tom from smoking inside. This wouldn't be a case where we could merely restrict his behavior. He would have to step outside. He can't sort of be smoking inside. I mean, this is why they don't have smoking sections indoors anymore. They have just no smoking. Now, on its own, the harm principle is not really too controversial, meaning there's not very many people who would likely disagree with it. Most people, I think, would agree that if something is causing harm, well, then it's bad. Shouldn't do it. That's kind of bound up in the definition of the word harm. But that's precisely what is controversial. Sometimes it's not always clear how we should define the word harm. What counts as harm? And how do we determine the scope and degree of whatever we consider to be harmful? That is to say, how do we determine how much harm is incurred, who it's incurred by, and how many people are incurring this harm? So how can we apply the harm principle of John Stuart Mill to this issue over YouTube's removal of the dislike counter from videos? Well, remember, as we said in the beginning, YouTube has claimed that the reason they've made this change is because they think it will help prevent a kind of harm, specifically harassment, especially harassment towards smaller channels via these so-called dislike attacks, where people kind of, I guess, get together and all dislike a video just for the fun of it. And generally, it seems that they also think that this will contribute to a much more friendly environment if the dislike number is no longer publicly visible. And we should also keep in mind that YouTube has also said that a simple opt-in, opt-out kind of system where channels can choose individually whether to keep the dislike number public or not, YouTube has said this doesn't work either, because then channels who choose to remove their own dislike number from their videos end up getting harassed anyway, I guess, in the comments. The main criticism that I've seen against YouTube's decision to remove the dislike number from videos, at least from the public view, is people seem to be really worried that this is going to lead to people following bad information, like from tutorial videos, for example. That's one thing I see brought up quite frequently. People are worried that someone will click on a tutorial video that at one time might have had a lot of dislikes and therefore would have signaled, hey, don't watch this, there's bad information here. So presumably someone might click on this video unknowingly, follow the bad information, and then potentially incur harm. So let's look at a couple of examples, one from each side of this debate. That is to say, one that encapsulates the concerns of the critics of this decision, and one that encapsulates the concerns that YouTube ostensibly has, which caused them to make this change in the first place. So let's think about a channel, say that it's owned by someone named Renee, like Rene Descartes. And Renee has a channel about, I don't know, one of those video game playing, talking about video games channels. And Renee is really excited. He's just put out his latest upload. He's got 2 subscribers. He thinks this last video he put up is maybe his best work yet. For some reason, maybe there is no reason, a bunch of trolls get together and decide to dislike his video en masse. Maybe a dozen or so of them all just pile on and start disliking his video. Now, people are not clicking on Renee's video because they're concerned that it's poor quality or misinformative. And Renee is very upset by this, very sad. He's not getting to enjoy the benefits of having a successful channel. And really, it's not even that. He's not even getting to enjoy like the bare minimum. Maybe he doesn't want to be like the next PewDiePie or something. Maybe he just wants to have a few devoted followers or subscribers that tune in and watch him stream his video game commentary. That's important to him. It's a hobby. He likes doing it. And now it's ruined because of this so-called dislike attack on his channel. So there's the harm that poor Renee incurred as a result of allowing the dislike number to be public. Theoretically, at least YouTube seems to think so, removing the dislike number would eliminate situations like that from happening. Now let's consider a different example. A YouTube user, not a creator, just a user, viewer of videos on the website, named Friedrich, wants to know how to change his windshield wipers. If you've ever had to do that, it still baffles me. So he's scrolling through YouTube looking for a tutorial on how to change the windshield wipers on his particular vehicle. He finds one and he clicks on it. Now, what Friedrich doesn't know, because in this example, we're imagining that YouTube has fully implemented this new change, so the dislike number is no longer public. And what Friedrich doesn't know is that this video he's watching at one time had over 100 dislikes and only 10 likes. Now, previously, critics would argue that would signal to Friedrich not to watch the video. But unfortunately, he does. And as a result of the bad information, he ends up taking out one of his eyeballs as he's changing his windshield wipers. Ouch. Presumably, at least this is what critics of this policy change would argue, this kind of situation can be avoided precisely by having the dislike counter visible to the public view. And that by removing the number from public view on this video in our example, Friedrich might not be the only one to suffer this unfortunate consequence. Now, what makes this controversial, what makes it a philosophical problem, is precisely that both of these hypothetical individuals are harmed. But I think it's clear that one of them is very obviously harmed more than the other. So at this point, it seems like Friedrich's harm is much greater than Renee's harm. And therefore, we may want to conclude that YouTube is wrong to remove the dislike counter, as many people have suggested. But there are some objections, I think, that we should consider. Let's start with some possible objections that someone might raise if they were to hear the argument kind of expressed in the Friedrich example. The guy who gets injured because he followed some bad information from a tutorial on YouTube about how to change his windshield wipers. Suppose someone were to craft that thought experiment and then use it as support for the arguments that YouTube should not have removed the dislike counter from public view. How might someone, maybe YouTube, respond to that? Well, they might object that Friedrich, the viewer of that video, should have read the comments. Sure, he can't see at a glance that the dislikes greatly outnumber the likes, so he can't stay away from it. Maybe it's very clickbaity, the picture, so he's drawn into it. He doesn't know anything about the previous number of dislikes, etc. But he could have read the comments, because presumably people might have left negative, critical reviews. How might someone who really wants to hold on to this argument respond? Well, they might say, sure, in theory, Friedrich could read the comments, but is it really that unlikely that the video's creator could have possibly removed all negative or critical comments from that video? That's certainly within the realm of possibility. It's possible that Friedrich could watch the video and only see positive comments because those are the only ones that the creator of the video allowed. So that's one possibility. Suppose someone were to object again. Well, all right, I'll grant you that the creator could have removed any negative comments. I'll grant you that it's maybe more possible that Friedrich could watch a misinformative video, but he could have also watched other videos. He could have cross-referenced this video with others. He could have checked more than one place for information. Maybe he watches this very bad video, but then watches one or two other really good ones and decides to follow the good information. He uses his common sense to figure that out of these 3 videos I've watched, these 2 seem reliable. I'll follow their directions. Someone might respond to that by saying, well, it's not Friedrich's responsibility, or it shouldn't be his responsibility to watch more videos, spend more of his time, when YouTube could very easily just make it possible for him to see quickly and at a glance how other viewers have rated that video, and thereby avoiding his unfortunate injury. One final objection I can think of might be that, well, maybe Friedrich should not have consulted YouTube in the first place for this information. Maybe no one should consult YouTube for any information about how to do things. Maybe people shouldn't consult the internet at all for information that is reliable and accurate. Now, intuitively, this objection, I think, is pretty ill-conceived. However, I'm not sure it's clear immediately what exactly is wrong with it. And that's why I actually left it open. I drew a little question mark there because I'm kind of looking to hear what you would have to say. If someone were to say, well, it's this guy's fault because he shouldn't have consulted YouTube, possibly anywhere on the internet, for this kind of information. What do you think about that? Another possible objection is that someone might argue it's much less likely that someone will experience the kind of consequences that Friedrich did in his example of getting injured from watching a bad tutorial. They might say it's much more likely that someone will experience the kind of harm incurred by Renee in the first example, i.e., harassment. Maybe it's more likely that harassment via these dislike attacks is going to happen with much more frequency than these horrible injuries that could be incurred from a bad tutorial on changing your windshield wipers, for instance. There's a few different responses that I think we could offer to this objection. Let's take a look at each of them. I think it's really hard to prove that the number of cases like Renee's would in fact be far greater than the number of cases like Friedrich's without some kind of data to support that, which of course we have no access to yet because these changes have not yet been fully implemented. So at this point, it's really hard to say for sure either way. Remember earlier I said that a lot of times what people are really disagreeing is over how you actually define the term harm. What counts as harm and which harms are more severe than others? I think everyone agrees there is such a thing as physical harm and there's also such a thing as emotional harm. I think some people would disagree over which one is more severe. For example, does the emotional harm of being harassed through a dislike attack outweigh the physical harm of someone like the Friedrich example, having a physical injury as a result of bad info they got from a YouTube video, is the emotional harm that someone receives because they got bad gaming info, they got bad cheat codes for their video game. Is that worse than the person who's getting harassed through the dislike attacks and trolling and such? These are things to consider. These are things to think about. In ethics, a lot of times you'll have people that are arguing for the same cause, the same side of a debate, but they might not necessarily be supporting that cause or arguing that side of the debate for exactly the same reasons. They may not be going about their argumentation in exactly the same way. Throughout this video, we've mostly been thinking about what are known as consequentialist arguments. Consequentialist ethics, as the name would suggest, places emphasis squarely on the consequences of an action. Want to know if an action is morally right or morally wrong? You need only look at the consequences of that action. One specific and probably the best well-known variant of consequentialism is utilitarianism. Any of the times we were doing our quote-unquote moral calculus, as in trying to figure out, okay, how much harm is being doled out, how many people are harmed, etc., that is a staple of utilitarian ethics, that kind of calculation, trying to figure out how many people are harmed and how much harm is being incurred, weighing that out on the scales, and then determining which action is morally correct. This last objection does not follow from a consequentialist approach. Instead, it follows from a deontological approach. Deontology in ethics is a school of thought that is mutually exclusive to consequentialism. But a lot of times, deontologists and consequentialists agree on the same things. So, for example, you can have a consequentialist who thinks you should abolish the death penalty. You can also have a deontologist who thinks you should abolish the death penalty. But a consequentialist is going to argue that the death penalty should be abolished because the consequences of the death penalty cause that action to be immoral. They cause the taking of a person's life to be considered immoral. For example, a consequentialist might say, well, the death penalty doesn't actually deter crime. There's statistics that show that. That's all very consequence-focused. A deontologist could care less. Honestly, a deontologist could say, well, I don't care if it deters all crime. It's still wrong. Why is it wrong? Because it's wrong. That's a very oversimplified definition of deontology. Basically, something is right because it's right, and it's wrong because it's wrong. How do you know when you're dealing with a deontologist or a consequentialist? Well, I can give you a quick hint. If you ever see the word rights appear in someone's argument, you can be assured that they are not arguing from a consequentialist point of view, because consequentialists have no need for notions of rights. It's not about whether someone has the right to do something or not. It's, does doing that thing cause harm, or does it increase pleasure? How much pleasure to how many people? How much harm to how many people, and so on. In fact, a very famous utilitarian named Jeremy Bentham once notoriously said that the notion of rights is, quote-unquote, nonsense on stilts. So that's what he thought about rights. For a deontologist, however, the notion of rights is incredibly important. So a lot of arguments I've seen, maybe not nearly as many as the more harm-based arguments, consequence-based arguments against YouTube removing the dislike count from public view. I've seen some people that are basically arguing like it's my right to publicly dislike a video. I'm not sure if I've seen anyone exactly say it in those words, but that's what I'm taking from some places where I've seen this being discussed, is basically there is an idea that it is your right to have your your dislike registered publicly for all to see. Is it a right? Is there a right to dislike? And if so, does it make a difference if you can still dislike something, but it's not registered publicly? That's, I think, an interesting question to think about. I think the free speech issue would be really interesting to look at here. And there's arguments on both sides, like anything else. There's people who think this is a free speech issue. There's people who don't think it has anything to do with free speech, and everything in between. But I wanted to focus more on the harms-centered arguments, primarily because that's the main line of argument I've seen. That's the main criticism that I've seen against this policy change. And if you want, let me know in the comments. Try and gauge how much interest would be in this. I can do another talk where I try and look at more of the right to dislike aspect and the free speech aspect. These are controversial issues, of course, but there really aren't any issues in philosophy that are uncontroversial. It's kind of what makes it what it is. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that introducing some of these philosophical concepts rather than complicate matters actually helped make things more simple, because ultimately having these concepts gives us a language to discuss in a much more efficient way, I think. Really the underlying issues that we're responding to. A lot of times we intuitively and emotionally respond to something, but we don't always feel like we have the words to express it. At least that's how I've felt many times in my life. And in many cases, philosophical concepts and philosophical ideas have given me precisely that language to express what I'm trying to say. Philosophy doesn't teach us what to think, it teaches us how to think. It doesn't tell us what conclusions to arrive at, it teaches us how to arrive there. That's what makes it exciting, that's what makes it fun. I hope that you enjoyed this. If you didn't, well, I guess you can dislike this video while you still can.